Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour on Goldster, Purpose, Passion and Grit, our exploration into what makes people do what they do, overcome all sorts of obstacles, stick with the plan, and very rarely will they take no for an answer. Now, we've all seen the television pictures over this past year of the war in Ukraine. Horrendous scenes of carnage, and in the past few days, victory celebrations in the newly liberated city of Kherson. Behind the scenes are hundreds of mostly young men and women who risk their lives to bring us the eyewitness reports and pictures. Now, these are not the staff television stars on the main networks. They're a very special breed, sort of generically known around the world as the fixers. And without them, we would get very little accurate news that they have, and they have very little protection. The mission of my guest today at the moment is to train them in hostile environments so their work is as safe and as risk-free as can be. But my guest is not just war and bandages. He is one of London's most acclaimed restaurateurs, bringing organic produce to his eatery in Paddington from his farm in Norfolk, which has been in the family for 300 years. And there are ups and downs there as well. I'm going to call it Downton Abbey with a flak jacket. He is the founder and owner of the now legendary Frontline Club, which has become a gathering place for, yes, war correspondents, but also politicians and other movers and shakers that enjoy a whiff of real danger in their lives. He is a fierce champion of independent journalism and gave sanctuary in his country pile to the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, and we'll hear about that too. Has also been shot at a lot. His life once saved by a bullet smashing into his mobile phone. So on that note, welcome Vaughan Smith to Goldster, Purpose, Passion and Grit.
Humphrey, thank you very much. That's a super generous introduction.
Well, it's probably full of journalistic exaggerations. Now, where are you exactly? You look as if you're in an archive.
Well, I'm in my office, and as you can see, it's quite scruffy, and because I'm overwhelmed. But no, I'm in Paddington, near the Frontline Club, where I work most of the week.
In the wonderful Frontline Club, which we're going to go into in some detail later, because that is one place and a half, isn't it? But I'd like to start with what you're doing and why we're doing this show, actually. The Ukraine safety training, and you're raising money to fund another course for people, and I'm putting a donation link into the chat there. Tell us, who are these fixers, guides and translators, and how are you helping them?
Yeah, absolutely. The fixers guides, well, actually, they're not called fixers, but I'll come on to that. What we're talking about is the local journalists and other people during a story like in the one in Ukraine, who do a range of things and are absolutely critical to the free flow of information. So if we talk about Ukraine, you may have been, say, in Kharkiv, a sports journalist, and suddenly the Russians invade, and you've just become a war journalist, which you can imagine is quite a shock. These people, and there are many hundreds of them, have an enormous role in us trying to get the truth out of a story like Ukraine. They will help Western journalists by being translators. They will put them in touch with the stories. They'll get them access by speaking the language and having contacts. So they come with their address book, and they come with a very good understanding of journalism. And so they're absolutely critical. What we're doing is trying to ensure that these people, the journalist from Kharkiv, who was, say, a sports journalist, has proper training, trauma training, and the equipment in the form of a medical pack, a very clearly designed medical pack for the task. And we're trying to ensure that they have enough training so that they can look after their own safety, and also awareness training of conflict. And so that's in a nutshell what we're trying to do. But it's quite
so, you know, we both worked with these fantastic people. They're local people. They're in the community. They suddenly, as you very graphically said, a sports journalist becomes a war correspondent. how do you actually make them safer? What do you tell them? What do you teach them?
Well, there's a great outfit, a great British outfit called World Extreme Medicine, and they specialize in trauma training and the provision of medical packs. And what we've done is we connected with them, told them what we want to do, enlisted their help and a certain amount of generosity from them. They helped support us, which was very kind, with certain medicines and things. And they designed for us a medical pack ideal for a Ukrainian journalist. In fact, any journalist working in Ukraine. It's quite important to understand what that is. It's designed not as a soldier's medical pack. A soldier will have an individual medical pack these days, but that's designed to look after them, keep them alive until they reach the military medicine medical resources. But of course, if you're relying on civilian medical resources, and journalists can't rely on military medical resources, you need to be able to keep yourself alive for a little longer to get to, say, a hospital or something which may be further away. So consequently, World Extreme Medicine, they put together this fantastic medical pack, which has tourniquets, splints. It's got this wonderful powder you put into wounds that dries the blood instantly, and so it's very much what's required for a journalist to work in Ukraine. We have been able to put those together for £90 each, and we then take them out and we give them to the local journalists who attend our courses, and we do several things. We teach them how to use that medical pack, and that takes 2 days. And they're pretty good. They're amazingly good students. They really want to know this. And you can see, I mean, we start early and we finish late, and they're very attentive. And then we have another day where we try to teach them how to keep out of trouble. Remember, I mean, I was an ex-soldier, and I do it with somebody called Paul Conroy, who's an ex-Royal Artilleryman, who you will know, of course, being a journalist, and because he's a rather well-known journalist. And we go out there. And we get local doctors who are extremely well trained, because since the beginning of the conflict in 2014, which of course I'm sure most of your audience will appreciate that what happened earlier this year, 8-9 months ago, was perhaps a continuation of when the Russians took Crimea and the Donbass originally. What we do is we essentially use those doctors on their weekends when they're free, and they teach our people. So it's in Ukrainian language, for Ukrainian journalists, with us providing the military requirements that of course you will recognize in terms of, as an experienced journalist, I know how to keep out of trouble as best one can. Yeah. And Paul Conroy said he was an artilleryman. And of course, the important thing about Ukraine is most of the casualties are caused by what they call indirect fire, artillery, mortars, and things like that. And so it's essential that they're trained very much specific to task. But our course has certain innovations. One of them, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so they've got the first aid kit. The sports reporter can now do critical trauma first aid, and then you can teach him that if he's looking at a bombed out place, the rubble, you can teach him where the shells are coming in from and how to look for booby traps and that sort of mines and that sort of thing.
Exactly, and quite importantly, what represents cover, what will protect you. I mean, for example, a classic one is, a bullet from the weapon that most people use in wars these days, say an AK-47, or they call it a Kalashnikov, will go through a brick, but it shouldn't go through 2 bricks. Unless you fire several bullets around about the same place. So that sort of information is quite useful. You don't want to hide behind a wall that isn't going to protect you, for example. And so you teach them a certain amount of sort of craft onto how to keep safe, but also some understanding of what's happening around them, so they don't get in the way or put themselves at risk, go too far forward. And we do all that in a day. So it's a 3-day course. But we can deliver that, and we pay for it. We obviously give it for free for £350, including a £90 medical pack, which is one of our main innovations. I mean, it's a very focused course designed to meet the need that they have in that country. Now, if you were to do that course, say in Poland, because we do it actually in Ukraine, we've been doing them in Lviv, and we're about to go back to Kiev and do them. If you were to do it in Poland, you're talking about £1,500. If you were to do it in London, you'd be talking about maybe £2,500.
Yes.
So one of our innovations is delivering. So we can do large numbers, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah. So you can go there, and I'm put in the chat, everybody. You will see that there is, and we don't usually do this on Goldster, but there is a GoFundMe website that anybody feels that they want to give a few pounds to helping the people that give us the news, because if they weren't around, Vaughan, and you and I have worked in many places all around the world, but if these people weren't around, we would not be able to operate. Is that right?
Oh, yes, that's absolutely right. You know, we all know so many of the people who, both of us know so many of the people who operate out there. You know, your Clive Myries, your Jeremy Burns of this world. I mean, they would be the first to acknowledge the importance in their reporting of local journalists, local contacts, what they call fixers. Oh, I have to tell you why you can't call it a fixer. In Central Asia,
That's right.
the term fixer is also used for pimp. So when you start calling them fixers, they get rather grumpy. So we're calling them local producers to avoid the inference that they're providing rather more. Fixers are a bit out of date now. But these local producers, are absolutely essential. We wouldn't be getting the news. And I feel we all have understood how important getting the truth out from, say, Ukraine is. And it's the same in all conflicts. Ukraine is a particularly good example, I feel, because the misinformation that is coming out is extraordinary. In fact, one can perhaps know what the Russians are up to, because what they're doing is accusing the other side of just what they're about to do, and so yes. It's extraordinary. But I'm not trying to suggest that it's only the Russians who misinform. Misinformation comes from all sorts of places. But if we want the truth, and we do need the truth, I think, because today in our country we're clearly on some level of economic war. We're related. Our economy is being affected. Our lives are being affected by this. We must know the truth. Now, I believe, because we all know we live in a much more confusing world. I mean, everyone seems to have a truth. Finding out the facts is very important. I feel very strongly that first-hand reporting done professionally is our best chance of acquiring accurate information from a place like Ukraine. And I just think it's absolutely essential. The free flow of information is just essential.
Yeah. And of course, when we're talking about these budget cuts and everything today, that goes into how we vote for our political parties, how much we give to defence and how much we give to hospitals. And so what these people bring to us, and to, as you said, the Clive Myers and Jeremy Burns of this world, the news that they bring to us is incredible. Now, if anybody's got any questions on this issue about Ukraine, but now we're going to move on to why Vaughan does what he does. We're going to go deep into his past, but also how to run a restaurant in London, how to run a club in London. I was talking earlier that it reminds me of Rick's Cafe in Casablanca sometimes, because of all the intrigue that goes on there. But I mean, I first met you many years ago. I think it was in the Kosovo War, but before that, you were in the army. And so why did you join the army? A mild-mannered man like you.
Well, it was a family thing. My family have always been in the army, and so I just carried on the family tradition. I was in the army for 8 years. I loved it because I'm a team player, and I really enjoyed it. But I wasn't so good at doing what I was told, which is a prerequisite for being a good soldier. And obedience wasn't necessarily my thing. So I was always slightly in trouble all the time, though I did enjoy it. So I left, and I ended up, I thought, right, I'm going to be a war photographer. I fell into a crowd of them, made friends, so I went out to Afghanistan and took it from then. But yes, I was actually your cameraman for a few days in Kosovo when you were a reporter for the BBC. And we had a great time. I really enjoyed it.
We did. But before that, you actually, your mobile phone got shot, didn't it?
Yes.
What happened there?
There was a particular incident at a place in Kosovo called Prekaz, which is a hamlet. and it became quite a significant place. I was quite lucky because I was in Kosovo early. I had actually just come back from filming one of the Pope's visits to Cuba, and my taxi driver from the airport was a Kosovo Albanian, and my wife at the time was from Sarajevo, and I was speaking in very poor Serbo-Croat to her on the telephone, which was recognized by my taxi driver, who said, are you a Serb? Or, you're talking to a Serb. Of course, the Albanians and the Serbs weren't very friendly at that time, and still not. And I explained the situation, and then I was a journalist, and he said, and it turned out that this taxi driver, was the kind of representative, that the Sinn Féin of the Kosovo Liberation Army type fellow in London. And so I got access, and I managed to get out there before it really kicked off. So I was at a place called Prekaz, when a Serbian group attacked, and they attacked with vehicles that they had taken off the Dutch army in an incident you'll be familiar with at somewhere called Srebrenica in Bosnia, 5 or 6 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And so I filmed this attack from a hill, and there was no news coming out of the place because I happened to be early, and it turned out at the time when I tried to get out, I was spotted, and this Serbian fellow shot at me a whole magazine. One hit my mobile telephone, which was in my in a pouch by my stomach, and the mobile telephone absolutely saved me, because a stomach wound would have been pretty unpleasant. But I still have a telephone with a bullet sitting in it. But interesting about that story, the individual whose family were killed by the Serbs was called Adam Yashari, and they call the airport now in Kosovo, the Pristina airport, Adam Yashari Airport. So I was sort of witnessed a certain part of history.
Yeah. And getting back to the hostile environments thing, so because if one brick doesn't stop a bullet, but 2 bricks do, and we all know in the police movies where they all crouch behind the car doors to their shootout, the doors won't stop a bullet unless they're armed, but a mobile phone will it? So if I arm myself with this, I'm going to be safe.
Actually, I read that a Ukrainian soldier was saved by a mobile phone just like that, but it may well have been a ricochet and lost some of its energy. But in my time, I had a Sony phone, and it was quite a lot thicker, and the bullet had gone through 6,000 Deutschmarks I'd wrapped into a roll in the same pouch. And so actually I was saved by money and a phone. It was made by Sony, and I rang up Sony because I thought, they'll give me a new one. And they didn't seem very interested at all. It wasn't going to sell phones that they're bulletproof, it seems.
No, they don't. But just to go, it's fascinating what you were saying. So to go through the politics, we're now got Russia invading Ukraine, and 20 years ago we're talking about the Kosovo War, was when Serbia, which is a Russian ally after thing, was repressing the Albanian population there in Kosovo, and it was one state. And then you mentioned the Srebrenica massacre, and that's the Bosnian War, isn't it, where the Serbs massacred the Bosnian Muslims. So this is the Balkan tinderbox we're talking about, really, isn't it? That we revolved.
Absolutely.
And of course now we've got the Albanians crossing by boat into the Channel and becoming part of the immigrant story this week.
Well, I know, and it does. It goes everywhere. Mind you, the Albanian gangs that our government keeps referring to are from Albania rather than Kosovo, which is a distinction because they are technically different countries. And of course, the Albanians from Albania have a different history. Remember, they were a very close society under King Zog and all of that, rather like North Korea. And whereas the Kosovo Albanians are ethnically very similar, but of course the same, but their mentality is a little bit different.
Yes, that's it.
But a lot different. Sorry, all my Kosovo Albanian friends will be on my case saying we're not bandits.
Now you be careful, Vaughan. But and I should also say, because we are now putting these shows into podcasts, and there's been somebody cutting the hedge or landing an aircraft outside that might have been picked up by the microphone, but we can move. I mean, the
on mine? Sorry, was the noise from me?
Because it was on my side.
I'm above the tube, literally outside my window there. I can see tube trains. So If I start shaking, it's because I'm literally on top of the tube.
And all those files behind you will fall down and
start shaking, yes. Or the bottles, the empty bottles.
But you were in the army and you were a television cameraman. Did you get shot at more as a television cameraman or more as an army officer?
No, very much more as a television cameraman. I got shot a little bit in the arm in Sarajevo. And well, I mean, you and I have been doing similar things. There are lots of incidents and lots of escapes.
Yes, but of course, in those days, back in you know, you were talking about, there were not the sort of courses that you're training people for now. That they didn't really exist, did they?
Well, you've given me my tiny little claim to fame was the fact that I used to run a freelance news agency called Frontline News Television, out of which the Frontline Club emerged. And that was through the 1990s. And in 1993, as a freelance group, very much bottom of the food chain in the news industry, we commissioned the first safety course by a company called AKE, run by somebody called Andy Kane. And that year, literally a few months later, the BBC, I think, were real pioneers in it. They took courses, probably did not even know we'd done ours. And out of that, today, yes, courses are very seriously. We do risk assessments and things like that were never done. In the olden days, I think journalists rather thought that journalism was solely an intellectual exercise. And weren't necessarily very practical people. I think the practical part of reporting from a conflict has really come to the fore. Not least, it's become more and more dangerous. 66 journalists, Humphrey, were killed in the last year. As you probably know, and that figure comes from Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders. And
of course, in those days, I mean, going back there, journalists were not the target, were they? Whereas now they are very much the target in many, many places.
Yes, I think I feel myself that changed in Bosnia back in the mid-90s. And I think that partially that's attributable to satellite communications. Before, we used to send, and you'll remember, rushing to the feed room with a tape and it being sent to London and all of that excitement, which was great fun. After a sort of hurried edit. But before then, before 24-hour news and satellite television, the people you were with would never see your work. So, there was never that, oh my God, you did that. And I think that the technology has very much promoted journalists to be part of the problem, or certainly perceived to be part of the problem. And it's not helped by PR organizations. I mean, our government has had lots of them, for example, where the information, and again we come to Ukraine where we see it perhaps more clearly than ever before. If you're looking for truth and you're trying to report truth, you're very often considered to be part of a wider information war, and I think that's really unfortunate, and it makes it much more dangerous for journalists. Certainly,
that's a really good point. So, anybody's got any thoughts on that? How we get our news and anything? Put them into the chat. Vaughan will discuss them, tell you about them, give us insights into them. But now I want to go to your decision that you've been shot at, you've been in the army, and you decide to open the Frontline Club. Give us your road to Damascus eureka moment that you decided to do that.
Well, I think it was it was a good idea. It was my only good idea, probably, but anyway, it was a good idea. I'd had a problem. The agency I ran, Frontline News Television, half of us were killed in the course of our work over 15 years, and it was a lot. I'd rung two parents to tell them that their son or daughter had been killed, and I didn't want to do that again. So at the same time, I talked about how we were, as freelancers, bottom of the food chain in the industry. That was really quite bad. I have to say, I very much at the time thought that there was a level of hypocrisy in news, where in journalism, we think that we have a right to criticize everybody in public life, and I'm sure we both agree with that. But at the same time, the elephant in the room in journalism is nobody criticizes us. And actually, we do deserve criticism if we're unable to look look after the people who provide us the news, particularly taking lots of risk. Now, I wasn't critical of everybody. There were, the BBC were good to us, Channel 4 were good to us very particularly, and a lot of other people were, but many more weren't. And very often I'd negotiate contracts for other cameramen and find that they wouldn't be honoured properly simply because people didn't have to. And so it was actually out of anger. We had the highest attrition rate in news journalism at the time that we knew of, and hadn't been looked after except by a few people who we knew. And we'd always had very good relationships with reporters in the field and people who'd been in the field, but back home it wasn't so common. So I wanted to do something to promote to promote sort of politically with the news industry the role of the underdog, the role of the freelancer. And because there's no doubt that the freelancer adds a huge amount to journalism, and they do even more today than we did then. So I started the Frontline Club as a sort of freelance insurgency, actually. I don't normally describe it like that, but that is what it was. And I invited the industry in, and because I'd been in the field and had friends like yourself and many others, you all joined it. But actually, it was about promoting freelance values of journalism, which I believe are quite raw. I think freelancers have, as a young freelancer, I realized I could never succeed in the industry unless I got the approval of the industry and the people who worked in it. But I was coming from the side, and therefore my standards had to be unimpeachable as other freelancers. So we became quite evangelical about it. And so in a way, I think the Frontline Club, it aims to promote, remember my friends who were killed, and on the wall, there are 8 of them, but also promote, the values they had, which are common values in most journalists. But it was quite a lonely thing being a freelancer.
And you've, you started more than or around 20 years ago, and I have to say it's a wonderful place. I mean, you've got that very comfortable first floor sort of lounge, sitting room, bar room. Well, that's the Rick's Cafe thing I was talking about. You do need a pianist singing as time goes by. But then you've got your upstairs room where you have these very spirited debates. I was there just the other day doing one about child slavery in West Africa, and you really, people do let rip there, don't they? And there's no.
Look, I am proud of it, and it's entirely charitable. So when you go there, Humphrey, and drink your next bottle of whiskey, that will go to charity. And so please do so very soon. Yes. It's all charitable, and I've worked there for those 20 years, but I haven't been paid because I don't want to be. But it is great fun, though I do get quite a lot of free food and drink, which makes up for it.
Do you feel, Vaughan, that you now have the respect of your peers that you didn't have before when that anger was bubbling? Has the front line established something?
Yes, I didn't expect to, because in a funny way, I'm quite a private person, and I had not understood that there's an expectation that you've got to be around, and that actually people suck up to you if you run a club. There's no good reason to suck up to me, I'm afraid, but people do, and in a way, it's because people like to go somewhere and know the proprietor. I'm not really the proprietor, as I say, it's a charity. But no, it is a good thing, but what it really is it's not a press club; it's a social club for journalists. The idea also came out of Kosovo when we were there. Kosovo, I was working as a freelance, but I was very much commissioned by the BBC most of the time, and we were doing daily news, and you would feed at 9 or 10 o'clock or 6 o'clock or whatever it was, and then everything would stop. Your day would stop. You'd been running around like crazy, very competitive. The day would stop, and then you'd go for dinner somewhere or get food with other people, and you'd meet up maybe half the people you met that day in your journalism, say a French radio person, a German, and you'd have a great meal, and they were such fun. And I wanted to recreate that. I was very conscious that as journalists, we go around the world, we report the world, and we make very close friendships with people because you're very much in a trench with them. And then perhaps we don't see them until the next problem, and that might be years. And so it was designed to try to bring people together and create a community. And it turned out that people want that, people value that.
It's also, it's a decompression place, isn't it? If you go back from a tour in a war zone, you don't exactly want to go straight home and sort out the school run and the fridge. You need a couple of days.
Well, so it's a very good way Well, you know this, when you were running around the world, keeping the social life going is quite hard, isn't it? Because you're away so
Yes.
much when you're on the road.
Yes.
And so this is a way for people to come in and out. So on your way in and on your way out, you can have dinner with friends and manage your social life. The other thing is the club is for journalists, really foreign journalists, and their friends. And the friends can often be interesting, because interesting people very often have journalists as friends. So you do get a really interesting collection of people. But Frontline's really about an interest in the rest of the world and what's happening in current affairs.
Yeah, no, I think, but you're not just Rick's Cafe, are you? Because the produce, you have a restaurant called the Frontline, which is open to everybody. It's not just, you don't have to be a club member.
Absolutely, it's open to everybody.
And it's it's got an organic menu, which means healthy food. And you used to, I don't know if you still do, ship it in from a pile that you own in Norfolk. You've got a farm or something there. I can see your face frowning. So correct all my exaggerations there. But what is it you've got?
It's more modest than pile. But it did get Julian Assange stayed there for 13 months with me, and I remember it being described by a barrister who was making fun of me that Julian was under mansion arrest rather than house arrest, because he was basically living with me during that time. And I remember being a bit grumpy about that. But no, it is a farm. But sadly, we have not been able to bring down food since the beginning of lockdown. We all have been under pressure. And of course, hospitality has had every single crisis has hurt hospitality since the beginning of 2020. So we haven't managed to do that. It's all been a little bit difficult, but we'll try and do it. I'll tell you what we do have. I do want to talk about the menu. May I talk about my menu?
Yes, of course. Go for it.
What we've done, because
I think I know what you're going to say, but go for it. Yeah.
In August, we had a £15,000 electricity bill, to my absolute horror, in the main building at the Frontline Club. And so I sat down with everyone and said, what are we going to do about that? And we realized that our kitchen was very hot, and that we'd have these ovens on quite a lot of the day. And then we'd have fridges and freezers who were trying to cool food in a hot room. So we thought, we decided, no more ovens. So by cutting out the ovens, reducing the amount of refrigeration, and we've changed our menu to make an energy efficient menu that minimizes the use of heat and cooling. And we found it more popular, and it has saved something like 35–40%. I haven't quite worked out exactly how much, but it's within that region of electricity in our buildings simply by doing that. And I find it interesting, Humphrey, because perhaps in the future we won't really be able to. Perhaps our expectation of, say, having 2 hot meals a day or everything on your plate hot may not be realistic going forward in an environmental crisis.
So I'm fascinated. Give us a precise idea of how a dish that would have been cooked in an oven now is cooked on a grill and then gets served up.
Well, okay, I can take the burger. We still have a burger.
Yep,
everybody
knows what a burger is.
Our burger used to have bacon. But you'd have to cook bacon separately and fry it separately. So you're heating twice. So you are using not quite twice the amount. So we've not got a bit of bacon. Nobody notices. That's a small example. But what we also do is we do the cooking in larger batches, which is very much more efficient. Rather than, and look, it's a slightly different style of restaurant, but it is more popular at the moment than it was. Rather than having a chef there cooking everything all the time and just creating all this heat, you would actually think more carefully. We actually have a bigger menu, but most of it is prepared in larger quantities to save energy. And it works. We still have a fryer. And there was a big debate as to whether we should keep a fryer.
And the other thing is, pioneering the energy-saving burger, are you? That is going to sweep the world. Yes. And McDonald's will take it up and everything. Like that.
Well, I don't deserve much credit. I was the person who asked for a solution. And I'm not to call me a restaurateur is super generous. Nobody else would call me that. And I would love to be one, but actually, I can't cook to save my life. But I can spot a problem and push for a solution.
Yes, and you do have the restaurant, which is one. If anybody's got any ideas of saving electricity and gas and cooking, let us know, because Vaughan can use them, and you might be able to use this.
But we all need them.
Yes, we do. We all have to think. This is what's called out of the box thinking. I'd like to go down to your country pile now. I know it's not that. It's a sort of, you know, a shabby detached house in on the Norfolk borders. But two things. One is your championing of freelance independent journalism, which breaks news and changes the world, and your house guest of Julian Assange, who did precisely that. Tell us about how that unfolded, and then I want to talk about a little bit about Julian and what he did.
It was because of the Frontline Club. One Friday, gosh, it was in 2010, I think August 2010. A tall, white-haired fellow knocked on the door with a young group of Icelandic people, asking if he could have a press conference the next Monday. But he wouldn't tell us what it was about. I knew who he was when he told me his name, because he'd just had a press conference sort of a month earlier in Washington D.C. in the large large press club there, and it had got and he had put out some video of a helicopter shooting some people who weren't armed, and you saw the very famous photograph,
in Iraq,
video
this was.
From Iraq, yes. And two of those journalists were Reuters journalists, local journalists, but employed by Reuters. And it was a big issue because the Americans had denied, and so it was very big news. So anyway, this fellow arrives, and he wouldn't tell us what it was about, but we gave him a press conference. I was intrigued, as you can imagine. It was rather good to have, you know, one of the most newsworthy people arrive on your door and want to stay. But he didn't just stay a weekend. He did actually stay several months. But I remember very well the press conference on the Monday, and looking at the journalists in the press conference, and I didn't think that any of them really understood what was going on. It was fascinating because it was so fresh. What Julian had done is his journalism was data. Well, he was talking about huge spreadsheets and being able to read things into this. And so it was quite a kind of foreign thing. The other innovation that he had was he had worked with 4 or 5 news organizations, and they'd all worked on different bits of this vast amount of data to try to extract journalism from it. And so it was an innovation, and it was fascinating to sort of be there. But anyway, he stayed. And then
let's just recap. What he did is that he released classified State Department information, essentially, wasn't it? After that, and a few of those, this was the big thing, and that was then published by mainstream media, wasn't it? The Guardian and the New York Times all sort of bought into this. So, and he got that from, was it Chelsea Manning, who was a sort of who had a sex change, didn't he?
Exactly.
So it sort of went through this stream of somebody, a whistleblower, that gave it to him. He processed it, gave it to the mainstream media, and now he is in jail, isn't he, for all this?
He's in Belmarsh. He's in Belmarsh. Since he stayed with me, he's had his freedom curtailed in many ways. He was in, you'll probably remember, he was in the Ecuadorian embassy for about 7 years. And then he was taken out by the British authorities and put in Belmarsh, which is a miserable place to be. I visited him once there. And there are 2 types of armband you get in that prison. You get a yellow one or a red one. And a red one means that you may have murdered somebody. It's a violence thing. He has a yellow one, but there were an awful lot of red armbands. I mean, the place is terrifying. But for someone like Julian, he's very much lives on the internet. He's got a sort of savant-like ability to process information in an extraordinary way. He's an extraordinary man, and he to be in prison and not have access to the internet is torture for him, no doubt. I mean, it's been quite brutal for him, and he's not as if he's it's a terrorist prison. He's hardly a physical threat to anybody. But anyway,
and he's fighting extradition to the United States, where he fears they will lock him up for life, essentially.
Yes. And there's precedent. Look, I'm not a lawyer, and he's got barristers who argue very effectively for him. But interestingly, we'll all probably remember the early days where he was very much in the news, all linked to Sweden and allegations of misconduct. Well, the story has moved on from there, and I haven't met a journalist today who thinks he should be extradited. The Americans planned to assassinate him. They spied on his lawyers. He's very much been bullied by process and monumentally smeared over a decade. He is a classical political prisoner.
We have a question in here, which I think is a very wide moral compass question, as it were. I won't say the name of the person because it's sent directly to me, but can you ask Vaughan to discuss why he supported Julian Assange, who released intelligence files that cost lives? After all, he, that's you, was an army officer.
Yes, and that's a good question. And the first thing I would say is, nobody has come up with any evidence that he's cost any lives. And I think that's quite important to note. And then I lead into the whole misinformation. There's been a vast amount of misinformation about him. What he put into the public domain has been used by journalists all over the world ever since. And it was done with other news organizations. Part of what he did that was important to me, and I'll get on to really why I supported him. Part of what was important was it was very important that we had a public conversation about what should be in the public domain in the digital age, in the emerging digital age. And part of what Julian did was stimulate a conversation that was closed down. And I think that's to our loss. There's no doubt about it. A society, if it feels threatened, is definitely going to value security over freedom. But at some point, there's a balance that the public surely should have an interest in deciding. And I feel that we don't really have an interest in deciding that. And I think we missed an opportunity with Julian Assange. So if you're prepared to accept, there's no doubt that Julian put a vast quantities of information into the public domain. I think where the right place on what should have been hidden from the public and not, is the point of debate. And I didn't agree on everything with Julian, but I don't like bullies. Julian was being bullied. He was being treated in a way that I feel when someone like Julian comes on the scene, and there are people who come onto the scene who don't necessarily fit in, who have something to tell us. We may or may not be able to learn from them, but I do believe we're judged by how we treat them. Putting Julian into jail in the way he has done and treating him, and this is important, he has not benefited from the quality of law or jurisdiction or justice, really is the word I'm looking for, that the rest of us expect to get and should get and would complain loudly if we didn't get. Do we treat people who don't fit in or have something to say, even if perhaps future generations will, and quite a lot of us actually did support him, future generations, I think, will be very kind to Julian. And journalists today certainly don't think he should be extradited. Do we put those in jail, or do we find a better, more civilized way of dealing with them, where we engage?
And what's your view? I mean, because we're going back 10 years now, so what is your view about this independent journalism and the digital age? Because all of us, if we've got hacking capabilities, can get into all sorts of systems. In Julian Assange's case, they're going after him. They went after Chelsea Manning, but they haven't gone after the editors and owners of the newspapers that published his material.
Well, to understand, absolutely. Nobody has gone to jail except for Julian, and Julian revealed war crimes. No question about that. So they went for the messenger. The other thing is, you have to remember in this country, and perhaps it's worse in America, under Thatcher, the protection, public interest protection, disappeared. And so consequently, defending yourself for these things is much harder. There's no public interest defense in this country for whistleblowing, which is a problem. But to really understand what happened to Julian and the way the Americans are behaving, I would refer to something that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, where he called WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks is, of course, the organization that was famously started by Julian. He described them as a non-state hostile intelligence service, i.e. an enemy. And what that did was it seemed to allow the Americans to feel, the American, powerful people in America to feel that it was okay to use the law as a tool, as a weapon, rather than as a means of finding justice. So consequently, what Julian has had is he's been smeared massively. He essentially the Americans clearly have feared a principled confrontation with Julian, and have decided just to do anything they possibly can. They even, there was a story the other day how they arguably interfered in the Ecuadorian election to ensure that Julian was kicked out of the embassy.
So you have,
yeah.
Sorry, so you have no regrets, no second thoughts about giving him the sanctuary and the help that you gave him, and you're still campaigning very hard for his release.
Yes, I don't have any regrets. But I didn't agree with everything. I'm not somebody who believes in radical transparency. I'm quite a conservative person in many ways. But I do believe in dealing with people in a decent way, and I do believe that, you know, transparency is very often better than hiding things. And I think the public have a right to know things and need to know things. Otherwise, we can't participate, particularly in a world that we now know today is incredibly confusing.
Yes.
You could look at political leaders today can often sort of get cult followings, and people who follow those cult followings seem completely clueless about the truth, because they're finding all sorts of strange things. The truth matters. I mean, it perhaps is the only thing that can actually give us any stability. Understanding the truth can prevent a fearful life. So no, look, I'm not saying that supporting Julian is a simple thing. It was a very, very, very complicated thing. I didn't agree with everything that he put out, and there were all sorts of things that I've argued with him before. But I believe in a better form of engagement with people like Julian.
And give us a picture of when you visited him in Belmarsh, what you see, how diminished or undiminished he was.
I saw a man who was. You have to remember with Julian, he was. I sort of used the word savant earlier. The Americans have said in court that he has Asperger's syndrome, which is high functioning. It's sort of high functioning autism. I understand. It's actually a term no longer used. It's a bit out of date. But that's when it was in date. That's what it meant. But he is somebody who has empathy. Julian gets out of bed every morning feeling that what he does is helping us, which is, I remember driving Julian to the police station when he before he had bail, and I saw him. I was driving. I look in the mirror and I saw a frightened man. I saw he was terrified, but still going forward what he believed in. He's a human being, and he got dehumanized, and that's not good enough. But what was he like in prison? Well, it was one of the saddest things I've seen, and it's a horrible place, Bill. I mean, maybe it needs to be, but only if you put the right people in. And he shouldn't be there. He's not a violent person. He was physically diminished. He was thinner. His complexion was white. I mean, he slightly stared. Conversations. He'd kind of slightly lose his way. He was never like that, and he's a very, very clever man. Julian, I liked him. I liked him as a person. I didn't find every aspect of him likable, but who is?
And a little what Asperger's, I think, is I don't know if it's still used, but it's when somebody can concentrate on one thing specifically, sort of knocking out the rest of all. I mean, I'm going to take back my former comparison of you to Rick's Cafe, Rick, because you're much more passionate and spirited than he was. He was a bit of a Dow Bauman that nobody would like to marry. But in the front line, how do you envisage this? We've just touched on a number. We've got a sort of Second World War type of war going on there, but we've just touched on the information age and how we get our information and things. How do you see the front line going for the next 10, 15 years or so?
One aspect of it is, I still try to support freelance journalists, international freelance conflict journalists, and I'm technically the elected representative by over 1,000 of them. Along with other journalists, we have a group that tries to represent them with the industry. It's quite a small thing, but an important thing. I think the future of the Frontline Club will be very much linked to how we can bring young people in it, and particularly in an industry that's not as clear. Back in the day, Humphrey, we all knew who was a journalist and who wasn't. It was very clear. Today it isn't. And we've got all sorts of and who is providing the news today that people are consuming? It's quite a complicated thing to answer. And so I want to engage all of that, but ultimately, I want to promote, or do what I can to promote with Frontline Club, the idea of a journalistic standard, which you would recognize from what you subscribe to, and I recognize from the time I was properly in the industry. And it is an industry standard, and it's a wholesome standard. When done well by the right people, journalism is very, very wholesome and sound. Yeah. And my fear is that young people coming in without the structures, without strong industry structures, the BBC is under threat. We hear all the time. Channel 4 was under threat. It may have escaped it, I hope. But when we've got our institutions threatened, we need other institutions, and that's what I want Frontline Club to do. An institution that links itself to a professionalism, a professionalism that will support. We've got to do something to help people trust. We're in the age of a lack of trust and all the fear that's linked to it. And I think that we can do our little bit, that we can't do much, but we can do something. We can have a building in London where we promote these things, and we can try and
people can mix with their peers. Jean Joyce in our audience says, my granddaughter has just started a journalism degree and is loving it. Jean, send her to the Frontline Club, knock
Absolutely.
on the door like Julian Assange did and said, is Vaughan there? Give me 5 minutes of tips for doing it. Now you've got your dining room downstairs, you've got that wonderful Rick's Cafe type of thing, lounge, sitting room, and then upstairs you've got where you hold your debates and conferences and that. What is the wildest, most angry one that you've had, and who was there? Give us a bit of scandal.
Do you know what happens? And we've been quite slow to manage it. Some pretty strange causes will book the room to hold events and use our backdrop to try to get the blessing of the Frontline Club. And literally, it used to happen twice a year, and I'd miss them all, and it was infuriating. Some sort of batty right-wing idea, or some batty left-wing idea, or something nutty. And so you'd have this person. And we've had all sorts of extremists. I remember at one point some right-wing group. Forgive me, I can't remember who they were exactly. Were complaining because there was a big debate whether we'd have him on the panel. And so he got a troop of people outside to complain. Finally, he wasn't let in. I was against that decision. I didn't make it. I thought he should have been let in because I'd rather hear these people.
You're a libertarian side of you wanted that, did it?
Well, I just think that if you don't argue with people, you can't show the other side. But look, we all debate this time and time again. Yeah. Anyway, this group, his supporters, went and vandalized half the street afterwards.
What?
In anger. I know. So we have had a bit of drama. People can sometimes believe things too strongly, can't they?
We could do a Goldster show there, could we?
Oh yes, I do it. You're very welcome. Very welcome.
And would you take, all this cancel culture that's going on in the universities, and if somebody's banned from speaking at a university, would you bring in J.K. Rowling or whoever and damn the consequences?
Well, my eldest daughter would be very angry with me if I did. But I probably would. I think I'm not a fan of cancel culture. I think you've got to flush people out. And I feel that I don't know. People can be very judgmental, can't they? But my daughter will disagree with me, and we have argued about it quite a lot.
Well, we better we'll go. I want you to stay there, Vaughan, because I've got to tell our wonderful people what's coming up, and then I'm going to come back to you for some last final thoughts. But we have on Thursday Tosca Lee, a beauty queen, the glamorous Tosca Lee, beauty queen from Nebraska, and she's also a thriller writer whose latest series, which I've got here, called A Single Light, is about climate, pandemic, melting permafrost, and cults. So, I mean, that's a gripping series. And we've got Maggie Piggott on Friday. She's got a How to Age Joyfully. I will ask you that, Vaughan, at the end of it. How do we age joyfully in the Frontline Club? Alistair Hignell is with us in a week's time, November 22nd, Purpose, Passion and Grit. He's with the sports reporter Pat Murphy, who's had 40 years of sports reporting and became a mainstay of the BBC's radio coverage. And Lucinda on the 23rd. That's an evening show, author to author, 6:30 in the evening is with the great Adele Parks, who's a multi-million selling novelist, whose latest one is called One Last Secret, and it is about power, sex, money, and revenge. I love that. That's the sort of stuff that I find if I come for a drink in the front line. Power, sex, money, and revenge.
Maybe nice.
Now, any tips? Because I'm not going to ask you your age, but we've got Maggie Piggott on How to Age Joyfully. But do we just keep going, Vaughan, or do we hang up our boots at some stage?
I must say I'll definitely attend that one. Well, it's interesting actually because my father died quite recently, and my favourite uncle. And there was something about those two people who I loved so much dying that made me think about this very question about how one might age gracefully. And I kind of came to the conclusion that friendship is incredibly important. And that actually spending time with people you care for is about what we have. So yes, I think you know, graceful aging is about enjoying time with fun people.
With enjoying time with friends and having a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Yes. And give us an idea. We've got a few minutes left. When are you doing your next training course in Ukraine? And tell us when that's happening.
We're very sure that we've got funding for it, basic funding for it, so that we've got enough money to go back out. We've already trained 98 journalists. Our aim is to go, yes, which is again, because it's so inexpensive, we can push them through. And we're then going to go out and try and do another 150, which our aim is to do 250. Looks like we've got money to about 100. We need a bit more money to do another 50. But this isn't just going to save the journalist. It can really save a life, but it's journalists help each other and they all go around in groups. Yes. So it's and actually fundamentally I think that every journalist has a right to have the training to keep safe, and we have a responsibility to train local journalists too. You know, they must be trained. And
will you be expanding this, because our focus now is on Ukraine, but there are wars breaking out all over the place where suddenly, as you vividly said, your sports reporter becomes a war journalist. I mean, Sri Lanka erupted recently, and you get tied up in protests and demonstrations. Nobody quite knows what's going on. Are you expanding this?
We would like to. If I can raise the funds to do so, we'll expand it. I mean, Syria would be a very good place to do it, for example. You could do the training, you know, if people come through Lebanon, you do the training in Lebanon. The key thing, though, for us is we're interested in this model where we can deliver it really inexpensively. And we can do that in Ukraine. If we can replicate that elsewhere, we want the numbers. There's always in training a balance between getting, you know, the high quality of training and compromising to get numbers and trying to get that balance right. We've got it right in Ukraine, and if we can do 250 journalists, then you know, interestingly, when it comes to the numbers for journalists killed in Ukraine, according to the CPJ, 38 journalists are being killed in Ukraine. When in fact, actually wrong. That's 28 from 2014. 15 have been killed during this conflict. That's 15 people who've lost their lives trying to report. We need to do something about this.
And there's I've got to do something later in the week on the Philippines, and there are journalists getting killed and threatened in the Philippines all the time. So I mean, what you're doing now, this sort of local thing, because not everybody can get hired by the BBC or Channel 4 and get given that £3,000 to get trained up. Yet, as you said, the news is coming from everywhere. And the more people out there, the better.
But also, we're training, Humphrey, I think it's very important. We're aiming to train those people who meet the standards of journalism that we require. That meet that, we're not just going to train everybody who, because you would end up training all sorts of people who aren't going to take it seriously. We need to do it to train those people who subscribe to traditional professional values, the people who are going to tell us the truth and do their very best to tell us the truth courageously.
And Jean Joy says that her granddaughter will enjoy watching this recording, which we are now bringing into podcasts soon. So, I mean, it's going to be all over the place. Vaughan, before I sign you off, give us a very 10-second tip for a young person wanting to be a journalist or a foreign correspondent.
I would say one route would be perhaps to study language, because that certainly can help. But the way to get on is try and get a job, sure, but your value as a journalist is very much linked to contacts and local knowledge. If you can predict an area that you think is going to develop a lot, be a source of great news in, say, the next 5-10 years, then perhaps you could visit there, live inexpensively, learn and try there, and try and make contacts. You'll be valuable to a news organization if you've acquired contacts and got a really good idea of what's going on.
Yeah, good, excellent advice. And time's wing chariot is upon us. That's it. Thanks for your stories and enlightenment. Thank you all for being here and for the questions and comments. Until Thursday, when we go to Nebraska with the glamorous Tosca Lee, stay curious, stay involved, keep questioning, donate if you can to keeping freelance journalists safe in Ukraine, and of course, stay Goldster. Thanks, Vaughan Smith. A great conversation. Bye.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you to the audience for
really
being interested. Yeah. Bye-bye.